Have you ever reached the end of the month not knowing if you were going to be able to put food on the table? There's no shame in admitting it. It's the raw reality of millions of Americans who work all day long, who don't rest under the scorching sun, who come home with their backs broken, and still can't manage to have anything left over. Nothing. Not a dime. The money disappears before it even makes sense. But today, I want to tell you the story of a man named Daniel, a bricklayer from Knoxville, Tennessee, a man who never had a credit card in his life, never had an account at a big bank, never had a steady salaried job, and who every 15th of the month disappeared from the job site before noon without explaining himself to anyone. His co-workers laughed. They called him strange, mysterious, stubborn. But when Daniel's life started to change, slowly, quietly, solid as a well-laid brick wall, the laughing stopped. And the questions started. What was he doing every 15th? Daniel's secret wasn't in an app. It wasn't in an expensive course. It wasn't in any internet guru. It was in something so simple, so old, so forgotten, that when you hear it, you're going to slap your knee and say, "Ooh, how did I never think of that?" Before I tell you, I only ask one thing. Subscribe to this channel, because here we don't make entertainment. Here we change lives, one story at a time. Now sit down, because Daniel's story begins on a Monday morning with his hands in the mortar and his heart on the floor. Knoxville, Tennessee, 2003. The sun came up too early in that city. Before 5 in the morning, it was already licking the tin roof of Daniel's house, heating up the small bedroom where he slept with his wife Rosa and their 2 younger children. The fan turned slowly, barely moving, as if it too were exhausted. Daniel woke up without an alarm. His body already knew the time. He put his feet on the cold concrete floor, a floor he himself had leveled years earlier with his own hands. He pulled on his worn work pants, the sand-colored long-sleeve shirt, and laced up his boots with the frayed laces he had never replaced, because new laces were money that could go toward something else. In the kitchen, Rosa was already up, small, hair pulled back with a rubber band, a floral apron over her clothes for the day. The coffee was percolating on the stove, a thick, strong smell that filled the whole house and was, in Daniel's opinion, the best thing in the world. She set the cup on the table without saying anything. He sat down without saying anything, and the two of them shared that silence the way you share bread, with respect, with care, with the kind of love that doesn't need words to exist. "Working late today?" she would ask, her back to him, stirring the pot. "Yeah," he'd answer, sipping the hot coffee slowly. "But tomorrow I'll pay the water bill." Rosa would nod. She knew what that meant. It meant there'd been barely anything left from the month before. It meant the water bill had been put off. But it also meant Daniel wasn't going to let it go unpaid, because Daniel had never let it go unpaid. In 22 years of marriage, even in the tightest months, the lights had never been cut off. The water had never been cut off, and the children had never gone to bed hungry. He was a man of few words and much action. Big hands from laying bricks since he was 16, palms rough as sandpaper, with cracks in the knuckles that wouldn't close right anymore from the dried mortar. When he shook someone's hand, the person felt the weight of an entire life in that grip, the good kind of weight, the weight of someone who had truly worked. On the walk to the job site, Daniel passed through downtown Knoxville, shops still closed, the baker opening the door, the smell of fresh bread mixed with the cold morning air. He walked slowly, unhurried, not because he had no schedule, but because he had learned early that running without direction only tires you out without getting you anywhere. At the job site, his co-workers were already there. Gil, the youngest, who was always complaining that the pay wasn't enough. Tony, who had financed a television on 18 monthly payments and still owed 12. Old man Manny, who was already in the red by the 1st of every month because the credit card didn't forgive. Daniel heard it all, nodded, and said nothing. He picked up the trowel, dug it into the mortar, and got to work. The noise of the construction swallowed everything. The hammering, the sawing, the battery-powered radio playing country music in the corner of the shed. That was every day. A simple life, honest, without luxury and without misery, but also without breathing room, without margin, without rest, until one day everything changed. It was a Thursday in July when the ground disappeared from beneath Daniel's feet. His oldest son, Marcus, 23 years old, came home early, backpack over his shoulder, head down, the look of someone carrying bad news and not knowing where to start. He sat in the kitchen chair and stared at the table. "Dad, I got let go." Daniel stopped, set down his cup slowly on the counter, turned to face his son. "When?" "This morning. They said the company was cutting back, but I know it was because I refused to work overtime without pay." The silence that followed weighed more than any wall Daniel had ever built in his life. Marcus had a young daughter, rent to pay, a tab at the neighborhood grocery store. And now, without a job, he'd come to his father with a proposal from his brother-in-law. "Sandra's brother knows someone who can get a credit card for anybody, Dad. No proof of income needed. We could use it to get by while I look for another job." Daniel looked at his son for a long moment, then looked at the floor. "No," he said. "Just that. Dad, we need—" "No," he repeated, with the same calm, firm voice, like a man checking a plumb line against a wall and not arguing with gravity. But the weak didn't let up. 3 days later, the drought that had come early that year brought the job site to a halt. The site owner, Mr. Hollis, a heavy-set man with a crooked ball cap and the air of someone who had never built anything with his own hands, showed up on Monday with the news wrapped in a fake smile. "Look, Daniel, until the rain comes back, I can't keep everybody on. You're a good bricklayer. Everybody knows that, but August is tough for everybody. And what are you telling me exactly? I'm saying that for now. I'm keeping just Gil and Tony. They live closer. You know how it is." Daniel folded his work rag, put his trowel in his canvas bag, and left without a word. But inside, his stomach had turned. There was a warm weight in his chest that he couldn't name. Not anger, not sadness. It was that thing that presses in when the whole world seems to be conspiring to push you back to the place you've been trying to leave. He came home. Rosa read everything in his face before he said a single word. "They let me go for now," he said, sitting heavily in the chair. She came up behind him, put her hand on his shoulder, said nothing, just stayed there. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the fan turning, counting in the dark what he'd saved, what had gone out, what still had to be paid. The water bill, the propane tank that was nearly empty, the notebook under the bed, that notebook he had never shown to anyone. And that's when Gil's voice echoed in his head, with the half-crooked laugh the young guy had. "Daniel, man, you're too stubborn. Everybody's got a credit card these days. You just make things hard on yourself." And for the first time in years, for the first time since he'd made that decision way back, Daniel felt the doubt, small, thin, silent, like a hairline crack in the plaster that hasn't opened yet, but is already there. What if they were right? What if he'd been making his whole life difficult for nothing? He closed his eyes, and in the darkness, almost without meaning to, he began to remember a night very much like this one, years earlier, in a different city, beside a different river, where an old man he had never seen before had sat down next to him and said something that had changed everything. It was 2001. Daniel was 42 years old and had just lost everything he'd saved over 3 years of work. A construction company out of Chattanooga had promised to pay 15 days of work up front and then vanished with the money. Simple as that. Daniel had worked, had trusted, and had been left with nothing. No receipt, no contract, no witness that was worth anything. That night he had walked out without direction. walked the dark streets until he reached the bank of the Tennessee River at the edge of the neighborhood, a place where kids fished in the afternoons and men went when they didn't want to be found. He sat on a large, flat rock at the edge of the dark water and stared at the moon's reflection in the river. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He just sat there, empty, like a house after the furniture has been moved out. That's when he heard footsteps on the gravel. An old man sat down beside him, white hair, the face of someone who had lived more than he let on, a simple button-down shirt, cotton trousers worn at the knees. He was carrying a stick, not a cane, just a thick branch he'd picked up along the way. Daniel didn't ask who he was. The old man didn't introduce himself. For a while, the two of them sat in silence, listening to the river run. "You lost money," the old man said. It wasn't a question. "I did," Daniel replied, without looking up. "And now you're thinking about borrowing to make up for it." Daniel didn't answer, but the silence answered for him. The old man picked up a pebble from the ground and threw it into the water, watched the rings spread slowly across the dark surface. "You know what the problem is with borrowed money," he said. "It doesn't come alone. It brings a tenant with it, and that tenant never leaves before eating everything you have. You're talking about interest." "I'm talking about anxiety," the old man replied, with a calm that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. "Interest is what the bank calls it, but what actually moves into your house is anxiety. It sits at your table, eats your food, takes your sleep, sours your marriage, bends your back before it's time." Daniel looked at the old man for the first time. "So what do I do? Just have nothing?" "No, you do what the ant does." "The ant?" The old man pointed to the ground. There, even in the dark, a column of ants crossed the rock, carrying leaves bigger than themselves. The ant doesn't borrow from any other ant. It carries one piece at a time, every day, at the same time, without fail. He paused. "Do you have a day in the month that's yours?" Daniel frowned. "Mine how?" "A day when you stop everything, sit down and take care of what you've put together. You review it, you reorganize, you plan the next month. A sacred day. No job site, no boss, no favors for anybody." Daniel sat quietly thinking. "Every 15th, the old man continued, as if he already knew what the answer would be. "You set aside what belongs to God first, then what belongs to your commitments, then what belongs to your needs, and what's left, however little it is, you save before you spend, not after, before." "That sounds too simple." The old man smiled, a wide smile, unhurried. "Did the things that work always seem too simple to people who are used to making things complicated?" Daniel looked back at the river. When he turned to ask another question, the rock beside him was empty. No footsteps on the gravel, no shadow in the trees, as if the old man had never been there. But the words had stayed, driven into Daniel's chest like a nail in good wood, deep, firm, not coming back out. Set aside what belongs to God first. Save before you spend. Every 15th, Daniel went home that night with the river still echoing in his ears. He didn't fall asleep right away. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, with the old black-cover notebook Rosa had gotten free at a pharmacy and never used. He picked up a pencil and started writing. At the top of the first page, in the crooked handwriting of someone who learned to read, late the 15th. Below it, 3 columns. The first, God's. The second, commitments. The third, needs. And below everything, a separate line, save before you spend. He closed the notebook, put it under the bed, and slept for the first time in weeks without his stomach in knots. On the very first 15th, Daniel set aside 10% of what he'd earned that month, even though it was little, even though it was an amount he'd have been embarrassed to say out loud, and put it in a brown envelope. He folded himself and wrote on the front, God's. He drove to church, put it in the offering without telling a soul. Then he sat down with the notebook and went column by column. Water, gas, groceries, the younger kids' torn sneakers. He wrote it all down, added it all up, and what was left, small, but it existed, he put inside a shoebox he'd kept in the back of the closet. The following month, the shoebox had a little more, but life didn't get easy overnight. Far from it. The second month, the kitchen pipe burst. Daniel looked at the shoebox, looked at the pipe, and felt the urge to take everything out and deal with it, but he remembered the old man's calm voice by the river. Save before you spend. He fixed the pipe himself, with plumber's tape and stubbornness, without taking a single dollar from the shoebox. The third month, Gil showed up at the job site with a new phone, financed over 12 months, and spent the day showing it to everybody. Daniel looked, nodded, and said nothing. Inside, he felt a twinge, not envy, doubt. Am I depriving myself for no reason? That night, he opened the notebook, saw the numbers growing slowly, month by month, column by column. They were small numbers, but they were his. No tenant, no anxiety sitting at the table. Set aside what belongs to God first. Save before you spend. Every 15th. He repeated it under his breath, like a prayer, and closed the notebook. The months went by. Then the years. Little by little, Daniel started noticing things he hadn't noticed before. When the due date for the water bill came around, he didn't feel that tightening in his chest, because the money had already been set aside on the 15th. When the younger kid needed school supplies in August, he opened the shoebox without a flinch, because there was an envelope marked "Needs" waiting for exactly that. His posture changed. The back that had always been hunched with exhaustion started to open up, slowly. The eyes that used to look away when people talked about money became direct, steady, unashamed. Rosa noticed first. "You're different, Daniel," she said one evening, while she was sitting with her sewing in the living room. "Different how?" "I can't explain it. More whole, like you stopped running from something." He didn't answer, but inside, he knew what had changed. He had stopped owing explanations to the month that had passed. He had stopped paying today for what he'd spent yesterday. He had stopped living in the deficit of the past and started building the foundation of the future, brick by brick, 15th by 15th. But the biggest test was still to come. It was in the 4th year that Mr. Hollis, the same site owner who had let Daniel go during the drought, came back with a big contract in hand and needed a reliable bricklayer to run the job. He called Gil first. Gil had been asking for salary advances since his first week. The financed phone had turned into a financed TV, which had turned into a financed refrigerator. And the paycheck never came in full because there was always a payment waiting. So Mr. Hollis went to Daniel. "Nah, I know I was wrong before," he said, not quite meeting Daniel's eyes. "But you're the best bricklayer I know, and you've never asked me for an advance, never complicated anything. I need someone like that on this job." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He thought about the old man by the river. He thought about the notebook under the bed. He thought about the envelopes, the columns, the 15ths he'd honored without missing a single one in 4 years. "You're right," he said, "but this time we're putting it in writing." Mr. Hollis nodded, with the respect that hadn't been there 4 years before. "Set aside what belongs to God first. Save before you spend. Every 15th. The ant had carried piece by piece, and the anthill had grown slowly, firmly, solid as a well-laid brick wall. The contract with Mr. Hollis lasted 8 months. It was the longest job Daniel had ever run, a 3-story commercial building in downtown Knoxville, and for the first time he received every payment on time, on the agreed date, with no delays and no deductions. On the 15th of that month, Daniel opened the notebook, did the math, and stared at the number for a long time. The shoebox had become an account at a local credit union, not a big bank, but a place where he knew the manager by name, and the manager knew him back. The amount in there wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to pay 6 months of bills without working a single day. 6 months of peace, saved in silence, 15th by 15th, without anyone knowing. That's when Marcus, the son who had lost his job years earlier, sat with his father on the back porch and said, "Dad, I need to understand something. Tony told me you've never used a credit card, never taken out a loan, never asked for an advance. How did you get to where you are?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the yard, the oak tree he'd planted when the younger kid was born, that now gave enough shade to cover the whole porch. "I learned that money saved before spending is different from money left over after," he said slowly, "because money left over after never actually gets left over." Marcus frowned. "And the 15th? Every 15th I stop, I sit down, I look at what came in, what went out, what needs to go out, and what's staying. First I set aside God's, then the commitments, then the needs, and what's left, however little it is, goes into the savings before anything else." His son looked at him with an expression Daniel had never seen on his face. It wasn't admiration, it was recognition. Like someone who finally understands what they'd been looking at their whole life without seeing it. "And the company that robbed you in 2001, Dad, if you hadn't gone through that—" Daniel smiled, a slow smile, from someone who understood the joke God had been telling with years of delay. "If they hadn't disappeared with my money, I never would have ended up at that rock by the river. And if I hadn't ended up at that rock—" He paused, looked at the notebook on the table. That notebook would never have existed. What had seemed like a betrayal had been a direction. What had seemed like the end had been the beginning. Every drought, every layoff, every tight month had been a brick, and Daniel had been laying them, without knowing it, to build the most important wall of his life, the wall of freedom. The following week, Gil showed up at Daniel's door, head down, embarrassed look on his face. "But Daniel, would you teach me what you do every 15th? Daniel opened the door, invited him in, set 2 cups of coffee on the table, and picked up the notebook. "And this is where I leave Daniel's story and speak directly to you. Because you didn't end up here by accident. You stayed until the end, because something in this story touched you. Maybe it's the squeeze at the end of the month you know well. Maybe it's the weight of owing someone. Maybe it's that feeling of working without stopping and never getting anywhere. Daniel wasn't special. He didn't have a degree. He didn't have an inheritance. He didn't have a credit card, a big bank account, none of what the world says you need to get ahead. What he had was a notebook, a pencil, and a sacred day every month. Set aside what belongs to God first. Save before you spend. Every 15th. It's not about the amount. It's about the habit. It's about honoring what you have before you desire what you don't have. It's about understanding that financial freedom doesn't start with a big paycheck. It starts with the decision not to let money rule over you. What destroyed Gil wasn't a low salary. It was financing his life on credit, payment on top of payment, month on top of month, until the paycheck became just a pass-through, coming in one side and going out the other without even warming his hands. And what saved Daniel wasn't luck. It was the old man by the river, who you can call a messenger, can call wisdom, can call whatever your faith tells you to. But in Daniel's life, that meeting had the name of God, because that's exactly what the word says. A faithful man will abound with blessings. Proverbs 3:9-10. It's not magic, it's principle, and principle, applied with faith and consistency, becomes results. So today, I ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly, right here in the comments. Do you have a 15th in your life? Right below, I'm going to save before I spend. Just that public commitment, small as it seems, could be the start of a turnaround you'll be telling your kids about 10 years from now. If this story touched you, if you saw yourself in Daniel's life, in the squeeze, in the doubt, in the temptation to reach for the easy credit, then do me one favor. Subscribe to this channel, because here we don't make entertainment. Here we lay bricks of character, of faith, of purpose. one story at a time. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Maybe a son, a friend, a brother who is drowning in debt and doesn't know where to start. Sometimes a simple story does what no advice can. And don't go just yet, because the next video on this channel might be exactly what you need to hear today. May God bless your life, your family, and every cent that passes through your hands. Until the next story.